But retroviruses in particular are interesting because we get those from vaccines. All
Yeah.
vaccines, every single one, contain retroviruses. Immunotherapy, some cancer treatments contain retroviruses. So it's something that if you've had any of those in the past, you could have retroviruses, and the only option is antivirals for those to stop those symptoms. Tell us a little bit more about those.
So the retroviruses, my good friend Dr. Todd Watts has been doing a lot of research into that, and also one of our scientists is pretty well versed in it. And Dr. Judy Mikovits has really been a pioneer in this world. I know Dr. Dietrich Klinghart's been speaking about it as well too, and it's something that we need to understand is an epidemic, and we're not going to see really the magnitude of it probably for another 10 or 20 years, even if we made changes now, because retroviruses basically embed in our own DNA. So they do something called reverse transcriptase, where essentially they'll have their own DNA, they'll embed, and they have basically things in them that will allow them to insert their DNA right into ours. And now our DNA has retroviruses in it, and then we'll transcribe or replicate, and now we're having like these retroviruses is what they call them, DNA that are basically us, right? So you can argue as we're exposed to more and more retroviruses that we're becoming less human. And it's an interesting conversation, but the thing that I've seen is that retroviruses will be triggered at different times. So let's say you have some emotional trauma. You unfortunately lose a loved one, going through a divorce, something happens like that, a physical trauma, car accident. You have a chemical stressor. You get exposed, you walk out on a golf course and you get exposed to pesticides. You're in a moldy building without realizing it. All of a sudden you get heavy metal exposure. These stressors can then trigger that retrovirus that could be dormant for 10, 20, 30 years and all of a sudden activate it, where you think, well, I'm doing great with health, I don't have any issues, and all of a sudden now you have a trigger that can then basically trigger these retroviruses to become active. Now all of a sudden we have an issue, and when they're embedded in our DNA, it's like, wait a minute, this is definitely something that we need to bring attention to and understand. And we've been experimenting and working with some kind of research products in going after them. And one of the newer products, which isn't out yet, but Dr. Todd Watts gave me some to test out. And of course, always want to test the stuff out and see how it's going. And I took some one morning at a seminar that we were at. The next morning, about 9 a.m., took some again. And then around like lunchtime, I went to the bathroom. My stomach just kind of felt queasy. Went to wipe, and I'm like, that didn't feel right. I looked down, and this is the second time this has happened in my life. There's worms hanging from me into the toilet bowl, and they're dead. But I'm like, again? Because the first time was when I started with a Mosa pudica seed, about 17 days in, at a conference actually that we both attend. And, my stomach felt kind of rolling and queasy the day before. And then like I went to the bathroom, I was like, whew, I just feel so much better. But then these things are hanging out of me. I had to pull out. The second time it happened, I was on no antiparasitics, and I was just addressing retroviruses. And that's what really opened my mind up in the last few months of how connected parasites are with retroviruses. And you can kind of go down the research pathway. And it might be good just to interview Dr. Watts because he's done so much research in this category, but kind of correlating parasites with the correlation of retroviruses. So strongyloides, which is a parasite with different retroviruses, the HCLVs and these different things, and how they're basically connected. And so me going after retroviruses, all of a sudden I'm pulling, more critters out of my rear end, which is like, what? How's this happen?
Yeah. Yeah. And so it's not enough just to go after parasites. You have to address the retroviruses as well, correct?
Yeah, well, so you have to address it all, I really believe. And I believe that there's a right order, and I think I figured it out, but I'm always open to learning and always open to growing. So much has changed in this last few years. But when I look at, okay, let's assume you have all these issues, because the listener might be saying, well, what's the order? What's the right order? It's like, well, let's just assume that all these are issues, first of all, so we can, so we can map out the order. And then if you don't have them, great, you can kind of skip some steps. But I'd rather assume that people have a toxicity issue. I'd rather assume them to have a parasite infection than to say, I don't really think so, and kind of skip over it. And now it's like they actually did have it, and it threw them off. So it's super important to understand the order. And the first thing is understand what's wrong. So if we just assume that all these pieces are actually part of the puzzle for you, then the first step I would say is drainage, Wendy. And drainage is just about opening the pathways up. Because if you're going to start to detox, if you're going to start to kill off pathogens, whether they're parasites, chronic infections like, viruses or bacteria or retroviruses, they have to have somewhere to go. So a drainage pathway would be the colon, making sure you're going number 2 regularly. And how often? I like to recommend 2, if not 3 times a day when you have something that you're actually going after on the health side. 1 to 2 might be all right. That is kind of a good number just for, I would say, the typical wellness side of things. But 2 to 3, I would always err on the side of the bowels moving more than less, because as soon as you start killing things or as soon as you start detoxing, if that bowels back up, it backs the whole train up. It backs all the body up. The liver bile duct is a really important area. You mentioned the liver earlier, the kidneys. We've got the lymphatic system, the brain draining into the lymphatic system. The glymphatic system is what they call it. It's basically the glial cell and lymphatic together. We've got the skin as a sweat pathway. So what can we do to open up the drainage pathway to prepare you? And that's probably one of the most important things I see where people run into health issues, or they run into kind of the quote unquote Herxine crisis, is they just jump into, I'm going to kill stuff or I'm going to detox stuff, because I did that. I'm like, I have mercury and lead. Jump into it and then reacted, and leaky gut and allergies flared up and just a huge reaction. And I'm like, wait a minute, what? And actually at the time I thought, well, there's no way I could detox. But what I didn't realize was, I wasn't doing anything to get my body ready. And that's really what I look at drainage. So assuming you're supporting the drainage pathway, then the next step is the parasite side. And, there's a lot of testing out there, but honestly, I would say don't waste your money. I was actually just recently at a seminar this last weekend, and the speaker was talking about, he saw some research. I actually emailed him to ask him, okay, can you, send it my way? And he sent me an article, but he was still looking for the main one he found. But the article was talking about, or the research was talking about, doing a microbiome stool sample and then actually a physical exam of the colon to check the cultures inside the colon, and how vastly different they were, and how much that it kind of questions the result of even like microbiome testing. And I say that because kind of we're trained, in our society, like, well, let's run a lab, is there parasites didn't show up on a lab test, so why do I have parasites? It's like, well, parasites don't always come out in every stool sample. The labs are usually pretty jammed. They're trying to do 20 samples in an hour. They maybe spend 3 minutes a sample, and if they don't find it in that time period, it's negative. But then the other complicating thing is that when parasites die, some of them actually release an enzyme that will dissolve their own bodies. So by the time it gets sent into a lab, transit time, by the time the lab looks at it, there could have been a parasite. Now it could be gone or not really recognizable. So I don't like the parasite tests that are available, at least today. And I would rather just, put finances to let's parasite cleanse. Let's see what comes out of you.
Yeah,
'Cause
and
when you
there's thousands of parasites also. You can't test for all of those.
there's thousands. And I actually just saw some research a few weeks ago. I think it was done actually last year, but I saw it just a few weeks ago, that they DNA sequenced 10 different parasite species they hadn't ever sequenced. And they came up with 1 million new genes. And I'm like, 1 million new like, how far behind are we? Or like you're saying, like, can we really trust a negative? So I would rather assume like you have parasites, let's cleanse. And when you actually see stuff come out of you, you don't need a test to be like, okay, that was it, And especially if you end up like me, where you actually have to pull things out, they're usually dead. But it's, in the words of Shrek, always better out than in.
Yeah. Yeah. And so let's talk about that, the order in which we want to do things. Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Yes.
Where do we start?
First step is drainage. Open up the drainage pathway. It could be supplements that help support the liver bile duct system. It could be doing things like coffee enemas, castor oil packing, liver gallbladder flushes. It could be things to help move the colon along, support the lymphatic, dry brushing, sauna, right? There's all kinds of different things that could be in that regimen. So we want to support drainage. The next thing is we want to go after parasites. Parasites, the reason why they're so early in the journey is mold spores will live inside of parasites. So let's say that you remediate your house or you relocate and you're like, I am mold safe, thank goodness, but you're still dealing with chronic inflammatory response syndrome, SEERS, like Dr. Richie Shoemaker talks about. It's because possibly that the mold spores are still in your body, even though your environment's clean, because they're living inside of parasites and replicating. So parasites have to be dealt with to fully clear out mold from your body. Heavy metals, which I know you talk about so often, they're stored within parasites. So parasites are basically sponges. They'll absorb 6, sometimes 8 times their weight in a heavy metal. And that's why I believe personally that there's a parasite epidemic now, is because of the toxicity epidemic. So because there's a vast amount of heavy metal toxicity in our bodies, it creates an environment that actually attracts parasites. Our body says, oh, thank you for absorbing those heavy metals, but now you get the downside of the parasite. And technically, the heavy metals are still in your body because they're within the parasite. So you have to kill the parasite. Some of that metal will leave with the debris. Some of it will be released, which is why it's so important to be binding on to these heavy metals even during a parasite cleanse. But to truly detox heavy metals, I believe that you have to parasite cleanse first. And I did a couple years of chelation for heavy metals and never put it together about parasites until after the fact. And I look back now, I'm like, gosh, I could have saved so much time probably, but I also wouldn't have that same appreciation and wouldn't be able to, have a conversation about it right now. So we've got parasites will hold mold spores, parasites will hold on to heavy metals. And then research has also shown that different chronic infections, little ones, little bugs like Lyme disease, a bacteria, will live inside of parasites as well. So Dr. Alan McDonald actually showed that bacteria like Lyme disease live safely within nematodes, which is a type of parasite. So for somebody that's been battling chronic infection, they've been going after Lyme disease, they've been going after Epstein-Barr, and they're like, I can't get well. As soon as I stop my protocol, I crash. It's because you're missing pieces. Either you haven't addressed the detoxification of the heavy metals that's part of the biofilm that's protecting these critters, or you haven't addressed the parasite that's housing them. If we start removing the shields behind, that are protecting these critters, everything changes and actually becomes a lot easier. And what my good friend Dr. Todd Watts has been discovering with parasites in the research is when you have a parasite infection, it actually lifts up your Th2 immune system, drops down your Th1. Well, that makes you more prone to having a viral infection. So the viruses replicate faster and our immune system can't clear it out. So somebody that's dealing with like chronic viral load, they have a hard time actually getting well because of a parasite infection is messing up their immune system. And I personally went through a lot. Anytime I would travel, I'd get sick, kind of grew up always sick. And when I finally was clearing parasites out, like now all of a sudden my immune system's like titanium. And what I realized was that it was most likely making me prone to getting sick, that my immune system was all off. So parasites got to be first in order to clear mold out, in order to fully clear heavy metals out. And then I would say the chronic infection, like the virus, the bacteria, is kind of the last step because they will use heavy metals to protect themselves. They'll use parasites to live inside of, and it'll also mess up the immune system. And then remember, mold will suppress the immune system and make you more prone to that stuff too. So if you understand, like, okay, I've got Epstein-Barr or I have Lyme disease, the last thing you want to do is just try to go after that critter. You want to approach it in this order because that's going to speed the process up and you're less likely to crash too.
Yeah, and it's also, there's something to be said for, strengthening your immune system functioning, because I think for many people, they have compromised immune system functioning for so many different reasons, nutritionally, stress-wise, EMF, not enough sleep, not the right, they don't have to take the right supplements or minerals. And we need to do things to fortify our immune system so it can do its job and keep these infection populations and parasite populations under control.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's our lifestyle. And not to leave off, your diet, your food, that completely matters. I'd rather have you eat really good food than take 100 supplements, like let's start with the food. And then that's also not to include your mental, emotional traumas or stressors. Around the holiday season, there's the most anxiety, the most depression, the most deaths, unfortunately, in December than any other month of the year, So there's a big emotional component to health as well. But as far as like the 4 big things I mentioned earlier, I'd say that's kind of more that functional medicine world.
Yeah, and you have to be, proactively addressing any infections that you have. Get the populations down because the parasite poop, all the mycotoxins are releasing, cause a lot of symptoms and health issues. People have trouble metabolizing that and detoxing it as well.
Yeah, totally. And it's what actually creates food sensitivities and allergies. I mean, allergies are out of the world right now. I mean, there's so many different things that people react to. And dairy allergy is probably one of the biggest symptoms of parasite infection because if you think about this, when you eat food and you have some protein, our bodies should break that protein down into amino acids, which is basically the next step. We use the amino acids to then make neurotransmitters. These are the serotonin, the dopamine, the, what actually make us feel good and make our brain like, cognition normal. And parasites will actually eat the protein to prevent us from getting the amino acid breakdown. A lot of times people will say, well, take enzymes with food when you're parasite cleansing, which I agree, because then basically you're assisting the protein to be broken down to amino acids. So you're kind of like not feeding the parasite. But the key is we have to go after the parasites because when parasites are there, they're basically stealing our nutrients. They're robbing us from what we should be eating. And then they're also messing up the neurotransmitters, all the other things. So not only are we nutrient deficient, but then it also affects a lot of chemical pathways as well.
So, talk about your favorite parasite protocols. What kind of things do you recommend to go after the parasites?
Well, the number one thing I like is Mimosa pudica seed. And I'll say that again because I know when my good friend Dr. Todd Watts told me, I was speaking on stage about Lyme and hormones, and this guy in the audience started asking me questions like biochemistry. I'm like, either he's a jerk or he's like really smart, and wants to know some answers. And so we talked afterward. I'm like, oh, this guy's like genuinely nice. He just really wants to know like the pathways and things like that. He thinks very biochemistry. And we went to dinner with some other people that we mutually knew, and he starts showing me pictures. And I'm like, what is that? He's like, that's, this type of worm. That's that. I'm like, I want to try that out. My curiosity like definitely put me in. And he's like, well, this is Mimosa pudica seed. I'm like, Mimosa pudica seed. He's like, yeah, not the whole plant, not the bark, but the seed is what the sticky stuff is. It seems to work really well. So I started taking it, and that's 17 days in when I was pulling two worms out of me that was hanging from me into the toilet bowl. And it was a crazy story because I'm at a seminar, not speaking, just attending. No reason for the butterflies, and my stomach just felt like I had butterflies. As soon as I passed my stool, I'm like, I feel amazing. But then I saw the worms, and I yell at my wife because she's, in the hotel room, like, Heather, get over here. You have to see this. And at the time, my daughter comes running over. She was like 3 years old. She looks at me. She's like, Dad, why do you have string hanging from your butt? I'm like, Heather, get over here. You have to see this. And she's like, oh, this, like, that look like I'm looking, but I don't want to look. Like, what is that? And my mind started racing. I'm like, wait a minute. If I, a relatively healthy guy, have these, who else does? And the only thing I was taking at that time was actually Mimosa pudica seed. So that by itself could get you some great results. And I had a lot of symptoms, even like my nose would harden. I'd get like these scabby boogers inside my nose, when I was taking that. So I knew it had like this whole systemic effect. It's amazing for GI tract and just like a gut grabber, gut scrubber, really a gut support, which I mean can be used probably in any protocol, but it's got really great results with parasites and biofilm and candida and those kind of things. But then when I started looking into and using Ayurvedic herbs like neem, holorina, triphala, clove, these other Ayurvedic herbs have been used in India for years, with parasites, started getting some more things out. And that's kind of just opened me up to, okay, if it's an anti-parasitic, I'm going to try it out. And so I like varying it up. I like rotation, but I would say kind of that Ayurvedic blend along with Mimosa pudica seeds really a great foundation. And then, there's things like tinctures that work really good too, that get absorbed systemically, that have like the classic anti-parasitics like wormwood, black walnut, we've got lamatium. There's quite a few great products out there, but the key I would remind the listener, short little couple day parasite cleanses, be persistent, be consistent. So when I got those two long ones out, the next month and a half, it was like 4 to 7 inches, and that was like all my stools. And then it stopped, and I was like, oh, thank you, I'm all done, right? And then like a month later, stomach started not feeling great, skin started being a little irritated. I'm like, I wonder if I still have some more parasites. Went back on, same thing. Went another like month of clearing stuff out, and then it stopped. I'm like, oh, I must be done. Then the symptoms came back again, and I realized, okay, as soon as I stop seeing them, doesn't mean that I'm done. What it means is that either the next round of eggs hasn't hatched or there's another size that's ready to come out. So what I've kind of found clinically is big ones come out first and the smaller ones. So I had some obviously real long, like Ascaris lumbricoides roundworms. Then I had smaller ones. Then I ended up getting some pinworms. Those are the ones that make your butt itchy. And then of course my wife, her butt started getting itchy. I'm like, sorry, hon, so she started cleansing them because it's one thing, you're like, well, how do I get them? Well, even if you're not intimate with somebody, just living in the same environment, pets, cats, dogs. Do you let your pets lick you? Like especially a dog. It's like, do you know where that mouth has licked before? Do you let your animal sleep in bed with you? I mean, this is where it's good. I always look at, okay, who's the most, struggling person health wise? Start with them first. And then as they get a couple months into parasite cleansing, then do the rest of the family, at the same time, because you don't want to be sharing the stuff back and forth. I had a friend that she was having a hard time getting over Lyme disease, and then she actually treated her dog for it, and boom, she was fine. It was like the dog kept like giving it back to her. So understand that who's ever in your household, whether they're humans or animals, that can also play a role with your health too.
So let's talk about binders.